London, September 1940. While neighbors spent their evenings digging damp Anderson shelters in the backyard mud, one former shipyard welder was drag-hauling industrial I-beams through his front door. Arthur Penhaligon wasn't building a trench in the garden. He was building a fortress in his dining room. His neighbors called it a cage. They called him a coward afraid of a little rain in a proper shelter. A standard corrugated steel hut buried in the garden was all any sensible Englishman needed, they said. Arthur kept welding anyway, grinding seams smooth and bolting 2-inch plate steel to the top while they shook their heads. Then the night of October 14th came. A parachute mine drifted silent over their terrace row. The blast hit like a hammer to glass. Inside standard garden shelters, families felt the earth buck and heave as 3 stories of Victorian brick collapsed inward. Some were buried alive. Others crawled out to find their homes had become their tombs. But that welder's table, the ridiculous steel cage in the dining room, held. Dawn came, and rescue crews stared at a mountain of rubble where Arthur's house had stood. Then the steel groaned. Arthur, his wife Mary, and their daughter crawled out from beneath the only structure still standing, a table that had caught and held 8 tons of falling masonry. Interior temperature stable. Family alive. What did Arthur understand about vertical load, structural collapse, and the physics of falling buildings that everyone else dismissed as paranoid excess? Arthur Penhaligon remembered the sound. Not the explosion itself. That had been almost polite, a muffled crack from somewhere deep in the hull assembly bay. What he remembered was the groan that followed, the tortured screech of steel beams bending past their tolerance. And then the roar as Section C's overhead crane tore free from its moorings and came down like the fist of God. He'd been 22 years old, 3 years into his apprenticeship at the Clyde Yards, and he'd watched Jimmy Breslin dive under the nearest workbench, a massive thing bolted to the floor with legs made from surplus railway iron. The crane hit everything around it. Girders folded. Tool racks exploded into shrapnel. A half-ton of chain whipped through the air and turned a man's ribcage inside out. But that workbench held. The crane's arm came down directly on top of it, and the bench didn't even shift. Jimmy crawled out 10 minutes later with nothing worse than ringing ears and a story he'd tell in every pub from Glasgow to Liverpool. Arthur had helped pull 3 bodies from the wreckage that afternoon. 2 had been standing in the open. One had tried to shelter beneath a wooden equipment cart. Now, 18 years later, Arthur stood in his own dining room with a government pamphlet in one hand and a pencil in the other, doing mathematics that his neighbors would have called morbid if they'd known. The pamphlet showed cheerful line drawings of Anderson shelters, corrugated steel arches buried 3 feet deep in garden soil, meant to shield a family from blast and shrapnel. The Ministry of Home Security promised they could withstand anything short of a direct hit. What the pamphlet didn't mention was what happened when the house above you stopped being a house and became several thousand individual bricks traveling downward at terminal velocity. Arthur had measured his chimney stack the week before. 18 feet tall, double-width Victorian brick, lime mortar joints that had been curing for 60 years. He estimated 4 tons, perhaps 4.5 if the stack was solid all the way through. The front wall of the house, the one facing the street where the German bombers would come from, added another 12 tons if it came down in a single section. The roof, if it pancaked straight down instead of blowing outward, was close to 3 more. He laid the pencil down and looked at the pamphlet's smiling family crouched inside their garden shelter, protected by 1/4-inch steel and 2 feet of dirt. It wouldn't matter. Not if the house came down on top of it. The dirt would compress. The steel would fold. And the family would be sealed in a tomb of their own making, crushed flat or suffocated slowly while rescuers dug through rubble that might take days to clear. His wife Mary appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a tea towel. She'd stopped asking what he was calculating after the first few nights of watching him sketch load diagrams on scrap paper. Now she just waited. "The garden won't work," Arthur said. "The Hendersons have theirs nearly finished." "I know. Mrs. Chun says hers is quite cozy once you get used to the damp." Arthur picked up the pamphlet and turned it so Mary could see the illustration. He pointed to the happy family, then traced his finger upward to the house above them, which the artist had drawn intact and undamaged, as if the bombs only exploded politely in the open air. When Section C came down, he said, "We lost 9 men. 3 were in the open. 5 were under equipment they thought would protect them. Carts. A canvas tarp stretched over pipes. Tommy Fletcher tried to shelter under a wooden ladder. Mary's face didn't change, but her hands stilled on the towel. Jimmy Breslin lived because he got under something that was built to hold weight. Not built to keep rain off. Not built to store tools. Built, bolted, and engineered to carry load. Arthur set the pamphlet down and looked at his wife directly. Our chimney weighs more than that crane did. And if it comes through the roof, it won't stop until it hits something stronger than brick and timber. An Anderson shelter is sheet metal over a hole in the ground. It'll stop shrapnel. It might deflect a blast, but it won't hold up a house. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I need to build something that will. Mary folded the towel with precise, even movements, the way she always did when she was thinking something through. Outside, the evening sirens began their nightly test, a long wail that had become as regular as church bells. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked in response. What did Jimmy's workbench look like? She asked finally. Arthur almost smiled. This was why he'd married her. No hysterics. No dismissal. Just the practical question that mattered. Railway iron legs, each one thick as my thigh. Crossbeams every 18 inches. The top was 2 inches of solid steel plate, welded at every seam and bolted through to the frame beneath. He gestured at their dining room, at the space where their table currently sat with its spindle legs and polished oak top. It was ugly, heavy. Took 4 men to move it even an inch. But when 20 tons of crane arm came down, it didn't give a quarter inch. Mary looked at the dining room, then back at Arthur. How much steel would you need? More than I should spend. Less than a funeral would cost. She nodded once, sharp and final. Then you'd better start making your list. And Arthur? She waited until he met her eyes. Build it so it works. I don't care what the neighbors say. That night, after Mary had gone to bed, Arthur sat at the kitchen table with his pencil and a clean sheet of paper. He sketched the frame first. I-beams standing vertical, cross-braced at angles calculated to redirect force downward and outward. Then the top, plate steel, thick enough that falling brick would shatter against it rather than punch through. Bolt patterns, weld points, a structure that wouldn't move, wouldn't flex, wouldn't fail. He drew until his hand cramped, until the mathematics sang in his head the way they had in the shipyards when the work was clean and true. By dawn, he had his blueprint. By the end of the week, he'd have his steel. And when the sky finally fell, he'd be ready. The first I-beam arrived on a Tuesday morning, strapped to a flatbed lorry that blocked half the street. Arthur had called in favors at the yards, steel that had failed inspection for ship plating but was still rated for structural loads far beyond anything a house would demand. The driver helped him wrestle the beam off the truck and through the front door, scraping paint off the door frame and leaving gouges in the hall floor that Mary would have to explain to their daughter later. Mrs. Henderson watched from across the street, arms folded. By the time Arthur made his second trip to the lorry, she'd been joined by old Mr. Pembroke and the Chin family. By the third beam, half the block had found reasons to be outside. Arthur ignored them. He had work to do. The dining room table, the real one, the one they'd eaten Sunday dinners on for 12 years, went into storage in the cellar. In its place, Arthur began building something that looked less like furniture and more like the skeleton of a very small, very angry building. He worked in the evenings after his shift at the yards, and on weekends while Mary took their daughter, Grace, to her sister's house in Lewisham where the questions would be kinder. The verticals went up first. 4 I-beams, each one 8 feet tall, positioned at the corners of where the table would eventually sit. Arthur had calculated the spacing precisely, far enough apart to fit his family beneath, close enough that the crossbeams would create a cage of redundant support. He bolted each vertical through the floor joists into the support beams below, using carriage bolts 3/4 of an inch thick. The floor protested with each turn of the wrench, creaking like a ship taking weight, but it held. He was welding the first crossbeam when Henderson arrived. The air raid warden let himself in without knocking, the way he'd taken to doing since the ministry had given him a clipboard and a sense of authority. He stood in the dining room doorway, staring at Arthur's half-finished structure, and his face did something between a wince and a sneer. Christ, Penhaligon, what is that supposed to be? Arthur didn't look up from his weld. A table? That's not a table. That's a bloody cage. Henderson stepped closer, circling the structure the way a man might circle a dog he doesn't trust. This is what you're wasting good steel on. Steel that should be going to Spitfires and ship armor, and you're building. What? Exactly. Arthur set down his welding torch and flipped up his mask. It's a shelter. You have a shelter. In your garden. Like everyone else. The garden shelter won't work. Henderson's face flushed. He was a thin man, made thinner by rationing, and when he got angry his cheekbones stood out like blades. The Anderson shelter is ministry approved. Tested. Certified to protect against blast and shrapnel. What you're building here is, he gestured at the steel frame, is an embarrassment. A monument to cowardice. The Anderson shelter is rated for shrapnel and overpressure, Arthur said, keeping his voice level. It's not rated for vertical load. Vertical what? Load. Wait. Static force delivered perpendicular to the surface plane. Arthur pointed at the ceiling. This house weighs approximately 19 tons. The chimney alone is 4.5. If a bomb hits close enough to collapse the structure, all of that weight comes down. An Anderson shelter, buried 3 feet deep with quarter-inch steel plating, will compress under sustained load. The soil around it provides minimal lateral support. The structure will fold. Henderson stared at him. You're mad. I'm a welder. I know what holds and what doesn't. You know how to join metal. That doesn't make you an engineer. Henderson's voice had taken on the particular edge of a man who's decided someone needs correcting. The ministry employs actual engineers, clever men with degrees who've calculated exactly what's needed to keep British families safe. And they didn't design steel cages and dining rooms. They designed garden shelters that don't waste strategic materials and don't require tearing apart a man's house to install. Arthur picked up a piece of paper from the windowsill, one of his calculation sheets, covered in load diagrams and force vectors. The ministry engineers calculated for blast radius and shrapnel patterns. They didn't calculate for building collapse, because they're assuming the structures remain standing. But Victorian terrace houses weren't built to modern standards. The mortar is lime-based, soft. The walls are 2 bricks thick with no internal reinforcement. When a parachute mine lands close enough, the concussion doesn't just crack walls, it liquefies the mortar joints. The entire facade becomes loose masonry held together by nothing but inertia. And when it falls, enough. Henderson snatched the paper from Arthur's hand and crumpled it. I don't need a lecture on physics from a shipyard worker who thinks he's smarter than His Majesty's government. What I need is for you to dismantle this monstrosity, install a proper shelter like everyone else on this street, and stop making yourself, and frankly, all of us, look like fools. Arthur reached for his welding torch. No, that wasn't a request. I know. Arthur pulled his mask back down. But unless you've got a legal statute that prevents a man from building furniture in his own home, I'll be getting back to work now. Henderson's mouth opened and closed twice, working through responses he clearly wanted to give but couldn't quite justify. Finally, he threw the crumpled paper on the floor and pointed at the steel frame. When this whole ridiculous structure comes crashing down on your family, don't expect sympathy. And when they ask me why I didn't stop you, I'll tell them the truth, that Arthur Penhaligon valued his own pride over common sense and common decency. He left without closing the door. Arthur waited until the footsteps faded, then lifted his mask and picked up the crumpled calculation sheet. He smoothed it against his thigh, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Then he struck his torch and went back to welding. Mary came home an hour later with Grace. She stood in the dining room doorway the same way Henderson had, but her expression was different. Not disgust, not contempt, something closer to resignation. Mrs. Chin wouldn't look at me, she said quietly. At the butcher's, 3 women turned away when I walked in. Arthur set down his torch. Grace asked why we're different from everyone else. Why our father has to build strange things while other fathers just dig holes like they're told. Mary's hands twisted the strap of her handbag. I didn't know what to tell her. Tell her the truth. Which truth? That her father is right and everyone else is wrong? That he knows better than the ministry, better than the warden, better than every neighbor on this street. Her voice cracked slightly. Or that he's so afraid of being wrong that he'd rather be alone than safe? Arthur stood slowly. He crossed to where Mary stood and took her hands in his. Hands that were scarred from years of welding, rough as bark, but steady. In 1923, I watched Jimmy Breslin live because he understood one simple thing. When the weight comes down, you need something that won't give. I've spent 17 years watching what holds and what doesn't. And I know, Not think, not guess, but know that if a bomb lands on this street and our house comes down, that garden shelter will be a coffin. He squeezed her hands gently. I can't live with being wrong about that. Can you? Mary looked past him at the steel frame, at the half-finished cage that had cost them their social standing and most of their savings. Then she looked back at Arthur. Finish it, she said, and build it right. Grace asked about the table on a Thursday evening in late September, 3 weeks into construction. Arthur was installing the diagonal cross-bracing lengths of angle iron that connected each vertical beam to its neighbors at 45 degrees, creating triangular load paths that would redirect force away from the center. His daughter sat cross-legged on the floor near the doorway, watching him work with the particular intensity of a 9-year-old who'd been told not to ask questions but couldn't help herself. Why does it have to be crooked? She asked finally. Arthur paused mid-bolt and looked at the brace he was installing. To Grace's eyes, it probably did look crooked, a diagonal slash across what should have been a nice, orderly rectangle. It's not crooked. It's angled. Why? He set down his wrench and wiped his hands on his trousers, considering how to explain structural engineering to someone whose mathematics education had consisted mostly of adding up ration coupons. Come here. I'll show you something. Grace scrambled over, careful to avoid the scattered bolts and metal shavings that covered the floor. Arthur picked up 2 short pieces of scrap steel, offcuts from the cross-bracing, each about a foot long. He held them vertically, one in each hand, about 6 inches apart. Push on the top, he said, nodding at the left piece. Grace pressed down with her palm. The steel, held only at its base by Arthur's grip, bent immediately under the pressure, bowing outward. Now watch. Arthur took a 3rd piece of scrap and wedged it diagonally between the 2 vertical pieces, creating a triangle. Push again. This time when Grace pressed, nothing moved. The diagonal brace transferred her downward force into the 2nd vertical piece, and the whole structure remained rigid. That's what the cross-bracing does, Arthur said. When weight comes down on the table from above, the diagonal pieces redirect that force outward and downward into the floor. Without them, the vertical beams would just buckle. With them, the structure becomes rigid. The weight gets distributed across multiple load paths instead of crushing straight down through a single point. Grace studied the improvised model, then looked up at the half-finished table with new understanding. So if the house falls on it, the crooked bits push the weight away? Not away. Down and out. Into the floor, which pushes into the foundation, which pushes into the earth. The weight doesn't disappear. It just gets redirected into something that can handle it. He gestured at the bolts he'd been installing. That's also why everything is bolted through the floor joists. If the table wasn't anchored, the whole structure could shift or tip when the load hit. But bolted down, it becomes part of the house's foundation. Immovable. How much weight can it hold? Arthur had done this calculation so many times he no longer needed paper. The way I've designed it, with the cross-bracing and the plate steel top, it should hold somewhere around 8 to 10 tons of static load before the welds start to fail. More if the load is distributed evenly. Less if something hits it hard and fast in one spot. How much does the house weigh? About 19 tons total. But the house won't fall as one piece. It'll come apart as it falls. The chimney might come down as a single mass, 4 or 5 tons. The walls will break into sections. The roof will fracture into beams and slate. What we're really protecting against isn't the full weight of the house, but the individual pieces that could punch through or crush the structure. Grace frowned, working through the logic. What if a really big piece lands right on top? That's what the angle of repose is for. Arthur pointed at the top of the table, where he'd already welded the first 2 plate steel sections into place. When rubble falls, bricks, timber, slate, it doesn't stack up neat like building blocks. It piles at an angle, usually somewhere between 30 and 40 degrees, depending on the size and shape of the debris. The technical term is angle of repose, the steepest angle at which loose material stays stable without sliding. He picked up a handful of metal shavings from the floor and let them fall onto one of the plate steel sections. They scattered and settled into a rough cone shape, the sides sloping away from the peak. See how they pile? That's the angle of repose. Now watch what happens when I add more. Arthur dropped another handful onto the same spot. The new shavings settled on top of the existing pile, but instead of building straight up, they slid down the sides, spreading outward. The peak got slightly higher, but most of the new material distributed itself across the slope. Rubble does the same thing. When bricks and beams fall on the table, they'll pile up, but they'll also spread outward, creating a debris cone. The table doesn't have to hold the entire weight of the house in a single column. It just has to hold whatever settles directly on top, while the rest cascades away to the sides. He brushed the shavings away. That's why the top is flat steel plate instead of beams or mesh. The smooth surface encourages the rubble to slide rather than catch and accumulate. Grace touched one of the vertical beams, running her hand along the rough weld seam where Arthur had joined two sections together. Will it work? Arthur looked at his daughter, really looked at her, at the worry she was trying very hard not to show, and felt the weight of what he'd built settle across his shoulders. Not the physical weight of the steel, but the crushing responsibility of being right, of having to be right. Yes, he said, because there was no other answer he could give her. It'll work. Outside, the evening sirens began. They'd been going off every night for 2 weeks now, regular as clockwork at dusk. A long, rising wail that sent families scrambling to their shelters and turned the streets into ghost corridors of empty pavement and darkened windows. Grace didn't flinch anymore when they started. None of the children did. The sound had become part of the landscape, as ordinary as birdsong. But tonight something about the sirens felt different. Maybe it was the way they held their peak note longer than usual, or the way the street seemed to empty faster, people moving with urgency instead of routine resignation. Arthur walked to the front window and looked out at the darkening sky. Somewhere to the east, over the docks, he could see the first searchlights cutting upward through the gloom. And beyond them, still distant but approaching, the faint drone of aircraft engines. They'd been lucky so far. The bombs had fallen on the east end, on the docks and warehouses where the strategic targets were. But the Luftwaffe was getting less precise or less particular. 2 nights ago, a stick of incendiaries had landed 3 streets over, turning the Morrisons' house into a torch that burned for hours. Last week, a high explosive had cratered the road near the tube station, killing 5 people who'd been queuing for shelter. The war was getting closer. Not in abstract terms measured by newspaper reports and ministry broadcasts, but in concrete, measurable distances. Blocks, streets, houses. Mary appeared beside him at the window, Grace's hand in hers. Should we go down? Arthur looked at his half-finished table. The verticals were complete, bolted solid. The cross bracing was 3/4 done, but the top, the crucial plate steel surface that would catch and deflect the falling debris, was only partially welded. He'd need at least 2 more days to finish it properly, maybe 3 if he worked only evenings. Not yet, he said. The table's not ready. Arthur, 2 more days. 3 at most. Then it'll be finished. He turned from the window and met his wife's eyes. I promise. The sirens wailed on, and outside the searchlights carved the sky into geometric sections of light and shadow. Arthur went back to his welding, working faster now, more urgently. The aircraft engines grew louder, then passed overhead without stopping, continuing east toward the docks and the river. But Arthur knew what Grace knew, what Mary knew, what every person on their street was beginning to understand. Eventually, the bombs would stop passing over. Eventually, they'd fall here. And when they did, the table would either hold or it wouldn't. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to revise the calculations or add extra bracing. It would work or his family would die. Arthur struck his torch and went back to welding, racing against a deadline he couldn't see but knew was coming. October 14th arrived with fog so thick it turned the street lamps into diffuse halos of yellow light. Arthur had finished the table 2 days earlier, the last weld smoothed, the final bolt torqued down, the plate steel top complete and level. He'd tested it by standing on top and having Mary add her weight, then Grace. All 3 of them balanced on the structure, while Arthur felt for any flex or give in the frame. There was none. The table sat immovable, a steel island in the middle of their dining room, ugly and graceless and exactly as strong as the mathematics promised it would be. The sirens that night sounded different. Arthur noticed it immediately when they started at 8:30, a variation in the pitch, a wavering quality that suggested urgency rather than routine warning. Mary heard it too. She was in the kitchen washing the supper dishes when the wail began, and Arthur watched her hands still in the soapy water, her head tilting slightly as she listened. "That's not the usual pattern," she said. Arthur was already moving toward the stairs. "Grace." Now. His daughter appeared at the top of the landing in her nightgown, clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3. She didn't ask questions. They'd rehearsed this enough times that she knew what the urgency in her father's voice meant. She came down the stairs quickly, and Mary was already drying her hands, leaving the dishes half-washed in the sink. They gathered in the dining room, and Arthur pulled back the chairs he'd positioned around the table for this exact purpose. The space beneath was cramped. He'd calculated it to fit 3 adults in a pinch, though Grace was still small enough that she didn't take much room. They crawled under, Arthur last, pulling a canvas kit bag in behind him that held water, a torch, and a small first aid tin. Then they waited. Outside, the anti-aircraft guns started up from the battery near the park, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of the 3-inch guns, and beneath that the sustained rattle of the Bofors. Arthur could hear the bombers now, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, making the air itself vibrate. Searchlights swept across the fog, turning it into a shifting wall of silver gray that pressed against the windows. Grace squeezed herself between Arthur and Mary, the rabbit tucked under her chin. "Is it close?" "Yes," Arthur said, because lying served no purpose now. The first bomb fell 3 streets away, a crump of displaced air that rattled the windows and made the steel table hum like a tuning fork. The second was closer, maybe 2 streets, and Arthur felt it through the floor joists, a sharp percussion that traveled up through the foundation and into his bones. The third was close enough that the sound arrived as pressure rather than noise, a physical compression that made his ears pop and his chest tighten. Then he heard it, a sound like tearing fabric, high and thin, cutting through the thunder of the bombs and the guns. A parachute mine, drifting down through the fog on its silk canopy, silent except for the whisper of air moving past the shroud lines. Arthur knew that sound from the yards, from the times they'd tested emergency parachutes for the Fleet Air Arm. He knew what it meant. He wrapped his arms around Mary and Grace and pressed them against the central I-beam, the strongest point of the structure. "Hold on," he said. The mine hit 2 houses down. The blast didn't arrive as sound. It arrived as a wall of force that turned the air solid and shoved it through every gap and crack in the house. The windows blew inward, glass transforming into a spray of glittering fragments that scoured the walls. The front door tore off its hinges and sailed backward into the hall. And the house, all 19 tons of Victorian brick and timber and slate, began to come apart. The chimney went first. Arthur heard it shear away from the roof line with a grinding crack, and then the impact as it came down. 4.5 tons of brick and mortar landed directly on the table's steel top, and the structure beneath them groaned. A deep, resonant note that Arthur felt through his shoulder blades where he pressed against the beam. The table shifted, maybe an inch, maybe less, and then the bolts caught. The floor joists screamed as the load transferred through them into the foundation, a high-pitched shriek of wood fiber compressing beyond its design tolerance. But the bolts held. The front wall followed the chimney. Arthur heard it separate from the side walls, the mortar joints failing in sequence from top to bottom, a cascading series of cracks like rifle fire. Then the weight hit. Brick by brick, course by course, the facade collapsed onto itself and avalanched forward, burying the table under a growing mountain of debris. Each impact rang through the steel frame. Sharp, percussive notes that varied in pitch depending on where the brick struck. The cross-bracing transmitted the force outward and downward, exactly as Arthur had designed it to do, and the table held. Above them, the roof began to fail. The joists splintered first, snapping like kindling, and then the slate tiles cascaded down in a rattling torrent. Timber beams, some of them spanning the full width of the house, crashed onto the debris pile that was rapidly burying the table. One beam hit the edge of the steel plate, and the sound it made was like a bell, clear and sharp and somehow final. The table rang with it, vibrating, but didn't shift. Dust filled the space beneath the table, thick and choking, turning the beam of Arthur's torch into a diffuse cone of gray light. Grace was coughing, her face pressed into Mary's shoulder, and Mary's hand found Arthur's in the darkness, squeezing so hard her nails cut into his palm. Around them, the mechanical symphony continued, the groan of steel under load, the shriek of bolts holding back tons of masonry, the cascading rattle of debris settling into its angle of repose. And then, gradually, the sounds changed. The sharp impacts became softer, more muffled, as the debris pile grew deeper and new material had farther to fall. The groaning of the steel frame sustained its note, but didn't increase. Arthur realized what this meant. The pile was stabilizing. The rubble was distributing itself across the table's surface, spreading outward in a cone exactly as his calculations had predicted. The house was gone. He could feel it in the way the sounds reached them, no longer filtered through walls and floors, but immediate and direct. They were surrounded by rubble, buried under it, but the table had created a pocket of empty space. A void, a place where crushing weight met immovable steel and left 3 feet of breathable air between them. Is it over? Grace's voice was small, muffled by dust and Mary's embrace. Arthur listened. The anti-aircraft guns had stopped. The bomber engines were fading to the west. The only sound now was the occasional shift and settle of debris, the small avalanches as the rubble pile found its final configuration. Yes, he said. It's over. Mary's hand was still gripping his, and in the dim torch light he could see her face, dust-covered, tear-streaked, but alive. Grace's eyes were wide and terrified, but unharmed. They were breathing. The table had worked. Arthur looked up at the steel plate above them, at the beams and cross-bracing that formed their cage, their shelter, their salvation. He could see where the chimney had impacted, a visible dent in the plate, the metal compressed but not punctured. He could see where the bolts had bent slightly under the lateral forces, the steel deforming but not failing. Every calculation had held. Every weld had kept. The table that his neighbors had called a cage, that Henderson had called a monstrosity, that the street had mocked as paranoid excess. That table had done exactly what Arthur had built it to do. It had caught the sky when it fell and held it. The silence that followed was absolute. Not quiet, silence. The kind of absence of sound that made Arthur's ears ring with the memory of noise, his body still braced for impacts that had stopped coming. He stayed motionless for what might have been seconds or minutes, listening for any indication that the debris pile was still shifting, still settling, still capable of crushing down that final 3 feet. Nothing moved. "We need to get out," Mary said. Her voice was steady, controlled in the way it got when she was terrified but refused to show it. Arthur swept his torch across their small pocket of space. The table had created a void roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet high at its center. Barely enough room to crouch, impossible to stand. The steel plate above them was no longer flat. The chimney impact had created a visible depression, and smaller dents marked where individual bricks and roof beams had struck. But the plate had held its integrity. No punctures, no tears. The exits were the problem. Arthur had designed the table to protect against vertical collapse, not entombment. He'd assumed, foolishly, he realized now, that at least one side would remain accessible, that debris would pile up, but not seal them incompletely. Instead, when he directed his torch toward where the dining room doorway had been, all he saw was brick. Solid, compressed, floor-to-ceiling brick. "The front is blocked," he said. He crawled toward the opposite side, where the bay window had faced the street. More brick, but here the debris pile had a different character. Looser, less compressed, with gaps between the larger chunks. He could see daylight filtering through the upper portions, weak and gray but unmistakable. "This way," he said. "Stay behind me." Arthur began pulling bricks away from the opening, working carefully to avoid triggering a collapse. Each brick he removed created a small cascade of dust and smaller fragments, but the pile remained stable. The angle of repose was working in their favor. As he excavated, the debris above settled gradually rather than avalanching inward. It took 20 minutes to create a gap large enough for Grace to crawl through. Arthur sent her first, watching as his daughter squeezed through the opening and disappeared into the gray light beyond. Then Mary, who had to turn sideways and exhale completely to fit her shoulders through the space. Finally Arthur, scraping his back on the steel frame and his chest on the bricks, emerging into what had been his front garden and was now an undifferentiated landscape of rubble. The street was unrecognizable. Where there had been a row of identical terrace houses, there was now a gap, a crater of broken masonry and splintered timber that stretched from the pavement to where the back gardens used to be. Arthur's house was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Erased. Replaced by a mountain of debris that rose 12 feet high at its peak and sloped away at the precise angle Arthur had calculated, 37 degrees, the rubble settling exactly as the mathematics predicted it would. And in the center of that mountain, visible through the gaps in the debris, was the table. The steel frame rose from the pile like the skeleton of something that had refused to die, the I-beams still vertical, the cross bracing still intact, the plate steel top bowed, but unbroken. It was holding up tons of masonry. Arthur couldn't calculate exactly how much, but from the compression of the debris pile and the visible deflection of the plate, at least 8 tons, possibly more. The table had worked. Not approximately. Not partially. It had worked exactly as designed, and Arthur felt something close to religious awe at the precision of it, that mathematics and welding and cold engineering had translated so perfectly into survival. People were gathering in the street. Arthur saw them through the dust, figures emerging from the fog and the smoke. Neighbors who'd sheltered in their garden Andersons and were now surveying the damage. Mrs. Henderson stood near the crater edge, one hand pressed to her mouth. Mr. Pembroke was there, and the Chens, and old Mrs. Morrison who'd lost her own house the week before. They stared at the rubble pile. Then they stared at Arthur, at Mary, at Grace standing beside her parents covered in dust, but whole and breathing and alive. No one spoke. Arthur helped Mary down from the debris slope, then lifted Grace and carried her to the street. His legs were shaking, delayed shock, probably, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. He set Grace down, and she immediately wrapped herself around Mary's waist, the stuffed rabbit somehow still clutched in her hand. Henderson appeared from somewhere down the street, running, his air raid warden's helmet askew and his face slack with something that looked like disbelief. He stopped at the edge of the crater, breathing hard, and looked from Arthur to the rubble pile to the steel table visible in the wreckage. "Christ," Henderson said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Christ Almighty." Arthur waited. He had nothing to say that wouldn't sound like vindication, and vindication felt obscene standing in the ruins of his home while 3 streets over people were probably still digging out bodies. Henderson circled the debris pile slowly, his eyes tracking the steel frame, the visible plate steel top, the way the rubble had distributed itself in a cone around the structure. He stopped at a point where the dining room floor joists were visible, torn away from the foundation but still attached to the table by Arthur's bolts, massive 3/4-inch carriage bolts that had bent under the lateral forces but hadn't sheared. The floor joists pulled free, Henderson said, and Arthur realized the warden was talking to himself, working through what he was seeing. The entire foundation shifted, but the table stayed anchored. The bolts bent, but held. And the frame, he looked up at the I-beams. The frame redirected the load. It didn't just hold the weight. It redistributed it. That's what it was designed to do, Arthur said quietly. Henderson turned to face him, and Arthur saw something in the man's expression that he'd never seen before. Not respect, not quite, but something closer to comprehension. The understanding that maybe, just maybe, the shipyard welder had known something the ministry engineers hadn't accounted for. "How much weight is that table holding right now?" Henderson asked. Arthur studied the debris pile, the compression patterns, the visible deflection of the steel plate. 8 tons minimum. Possibly 10. It's hard to say without measuring the displacement. And your family was underneath it. Yes. Henderson looked at Mary, at Grace, at the 3 people who should have been crushed flat under a collapsing house, but were instead standing in the street, having a conversation. He took off his helmet and ran a hand through his hair, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its edge of authority. "I need your blueprints," he said. "Whatever calculations you used, whatever specifications you followed. I need copies made and distributed to every civil defense post in the borough." He paused, then added, "If that's acceptable to you." Arthur thought about Jimmy Breslin crawling out from under that workbench in the shipyards, alive, because someone had understood load-bearing principles better than the people around them. He thought about the Anderson shelters buried in gardens up and down the street, 1/4-inch steel over 3 feet of earth, and what would happen to the families inside them when their houses came down. "I'll draw them up tonight," Arthur said. "Proper engineering specifications. Materials list. Construction sequence. Everything you'll need." Henderson nodded once, sharp and decisive, then looked back at the steel table rising from the rubble. "We'll need a name for it." For the reports. The ministry will want something official. Arthur glanced at Mary. She was holding Grace, stroking their daughter's hair, and when she met his eyes, she gave the smallest nod, permission, or perhaps acknowledgement. The Morrison table, Arthur said, thinking of Mrs. Morrison and her house that had burned. After the woman down the street who lost everything last week. The Morrison table, Henderson repeated, testing it. Then he put his helmet back on and straightened his shoulders, the bureaucrat reasserting himself. I'll have engineers from the ministry here by tomorrow to examine the structure. And Arthur, he stopped, seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say, then settled on, thank you. He walked away, already pulling out his notebook and writing, and Arthur stood in the ruins of his home with his family alive beside him and watched the neighbors begin to approach. Not mocking now, not dismissive, just people who'd seen something impossible and were trying to understand it. Arthur looked back at his table one last time. Dented, bowed, buried under tons of debris, but standing. Still standing. The cage that had saved them. The monstrosity that had worked. The mathematics had held. And that, Arthur thought, was all that ever really mattered.